So we're the Maryland Association of Counties. I'm the executive director, Michael Sanderson. We represent all 24 jurisdictions, including Baltimore City and 23 counties. The typical county government puts more money into education than everything else put together. So that's the commitment that comes from the county level, and that's been the ask for generations. That's not a new idea.
But it's not a mandate.
So to some degree, we're mandated by the state, keep maintaining your effort in order to receive state funding. So that's, the state sort of says, keep the hammer down. This legislation would, I think, have the state dictate an even larger share of what local resources go towards. So those local property taxes and income taxes and odds and ends revenues we get from other things, nominally those are local decisions that the county deciding for themselves. But here, if the state shows up and says you must fund this many dollars to public education, it may turn into 54, 58, 62 cents out of every dollar is basically programmed by the state, give it to the schools, and then we'll review their categories and performance and so forth. So to some degree, this is the state becoming the lead player in an awful lot of public spending. This is something that a state like Maryland goes through every political generation or so. It's been about 20 years since the last time we gave a deep evaluation of the way we do public schools, how we fund them, and what we ask of them, and the results that we're looking for. So Maryland is kind of due for this evaluation. A sort of blue ribbon panel of lots of stakeholders spent 3+ years working on this effort. The Kirwan Commission, Britt Kirwan, a former chancellor of the University of Maryland, someone with a big reputation who's stepped down from that role but has invested a lot of time in this and brought these stakeholders together to say what comes next. Their vision is, I would say, ambitious, well-founded, and very expensive. And that makes it a really complicated soup of public policy. So I think in short, the commission has said in the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, depending on how you measure, and Maryland, one of the wealthiest states in the United States, we ought to expect that our schools should be world-class and our students should have world-class educational opportunities, whether it's to go to college and have a college-bound and career after that, or a more career-oriented and technical education. Whichever path students are choosing, they ought to have world-class opportunities here in Maryland. And if you start with that presumption, they sort of built a foundation to say what would it take for this state to get to that level. Not just compete with Virginia and with Massachusetts, but with Singapore and with Norway and with the worldwide competition that's increasingly part of the economy. Literally just yesterday was the big public hearing on this legislation. The bill itself is almost 200 pages long. It's an overwhelming issue to try and absorb all of it. So, taking a deep dive on this topic makes sense. The price tag by the end of this phase-in is in the neighborhood of $4 billion. And you could do some, pretty quick arithmetic to find out, that's a big chunk of money for a state that has about 6 million people. That ends up being, several $100s per year for every man, woman, and child in Maryland. So that's a big commitment. This is probably the most consequential policy decision that any of these policymakers are going to make during their whole political careers, is what to do here. Annapolis is fond of building bridges to an eventual destination. So the idea of, we think we're going to be making the big 10-year commitment, we're not ready with all the details on that, but let's get the ball rolling with years 1, 2, and to some extent 3. Part of that was spurred by the constitutional amendment that Maryland voters applied to the Constitution, saying revenue from our relatively recently embraced casinos that goes into an education trust fund, but that needs to be above and beyond current school funding formulas. So the state had already sort of committed, we're going to do more for schools. The voters agreed with that principle. So the idea of saying, let's take that committed money and use it for the first steps of this big 10-year plan, that's what virtually everyone in Annapolis was on board with in the 2019 legislative session. In 2020, it's sort of the whole enchilada, the 10-year plan, the big aggressive rollout of multiple different components of this idea. Well, I think right now you have in Annapolis the people with votes, delegates and senators, and lying in the background the governor with a veto, are all trying to weigh this continuum. I think there are some delegates and senators who are fully committed and say, we just have to find a way. I'm so committed to this end that we'll do what we have to over the next 10 years to get from here to there. I don't think that's everybody in the legislature. I think there are some, probably at another end of that spectrum, saying this looks like tax increases or it looks like dramatic cuts in funding to other things other than education, and both of those may be too high of a price to pay to go from where we are to where the commission would like us to be. And I think you have a lot of people dotted along the middle. Many of them just saw the bill for the first time over the last few days. They just had their first hearing yesterday as we're recording, and they're reading through a brand new 60-page analysis of the fiscal effects and the step-by-step pieces of what gets rolled out in year 2 and what's in year 5 and what's in year 8 and so forth. And the questions are all over the map. Everything from how do we find the place to give every 3- and 4-year-old a guaranteed seat for pre-kindergarten by a licensed quality education provider? That's a big bill to fill, and I don't think anyone really knows how we're going to make that happen. So some people are going to criticize it on cost. Some people will probably say these are the wrong elements. Lying in the middle of this is, I think, one of the most intuitive items in schools is a teacher-to-student ratio or like class size. Right? And everybody would instinctively say, I want smaller class sizes for better outcomes for my kids. I mean, almost every, you ask, survey Marylanders, and you'll probably get 80-90% agreement with that, and they can barely, 90% people probably won't agree that the sun's going to rise in the east. So this plan is not really about smaller class sizes. It's about investing in the professionalism of teachers and trying to bring our best and brightest over the next generation. Hey, don't go into high finance. We want you to think of the teaching profession in the way we think of like engineering. Same kind of education and rigor going into that training, and the same expectations for that as a professional field. That's a mindset change. It's an expensive and major component of this plan. I'm not sure that everybody buys that logic top to bottom. So it's part of the difficulty. If you haven't been following this for 3 years, you're a state senator, the bill just landed on your desk, you knew it was coming, and you're trying to figure out the money's going for what exactly? I think there's some degree of theater involved, and the governor, the governor feels that I think he got elected with a mandate to watch the bottom line for the state government. He ran against an administration that he claims, came up with, they've got a big number of tax increases or fee increases and so forth, and said, we need to create a business climate here that's more welcoming. Taxes are part of that message, and I want to keep, I want fiscal responsibility was a centerpiece of this governor's election strategy. Successful twice. So I think he feels duty-bound to watch the numbers very closely. Any proposal for anything that costs in the new billions of dollars, I think, gets his attention there. And so it was a pretty quick react for this governor to say, I'm skeptical about a $4 billion plan of any sort. And that's sort of without necessarily saying, I think this group did a bad job. The proposals are poor ideas. It's rather about affordability. And that's going to be not the entire debate, but it's going to be a big part of the debate. The price tag is so high and so consequential. This can't be it can't avoid being substantially a debate about money and funding priorities. It is big. The local consequence is varied by jurisdiction, but is potentially overwhelming for quite a number of jurisdictions. Both Talbot and Kent counties are looking at what the state would be, not, I was going to say asking, but really requiring of the county to contribute over a 10-year phase-in, and it's a big consequence. This means almost certainly a combination of almost all your growth in revenue over the next decade goes to education, and there's no room for much of anything else. Potentially cuts to other areas to put education first. And for some jurisdictions, it probably will force the issue of tax changes. One thing that lies in the background is most of the state of Maryland is tapped out with their tax rates, with the exception of the property tax. So to the extent the state is telling counties, you need to do your share, in most cases that's going to turn into property taxpayers doing their share. And interestingly, you do an analysis of who bears the burden of taxes. Property taxes they're not flattered by that evaluation. It tends to be a regressive tax that falls disproportionately on lower income taxpayers or homeowners or renters. So that becomes a question of tax policy as well as sort of fiscal priorities. So they're bundled up together. The plan right now asks county governments to come up with more than $1 billion per year by the end of the phase-in, on top of what we're already doing and projected to do. So that's building in school funding growth for the next decade that looks like the last several years. So that's not over the minimum, that's over the trend line. That number might be as close as, might be $2 billion in local funding above what the state currently requires. That's a big consequential investment. The impact varies dramatically place by place because they're sort of scrambling the eggs of the way the state formulas interact with county budgets. But asking the counties to be more or less a 50-50 partner in school funding leaves you with lots of needs to do a bandage here and a bumper there and a cap and a floor to try and keep the system from promoting inequality. I mean, one of the goals of this plan has been all children in Maryland should have great opportunities. But to the extent that you count on local revenues, wealthy places can tax themselves and provide resources well beyond less wealthy places. So there is a citizen-imposed tax cap in Talbot County and a handful of other places in Maryland that can be exceeded for the purposes of education. Education it's in the state Constitution as a fundamental responsibility. So the state, there's a limited opportunity to exceed that for purposes of funding schools. So property taxes are in play every part of the state. Yeah. Our general argument is, if you're going to do the next step of school funding and you want to promote equity, you want opportunities everywhere and close this achievement gap between the haves and have-nots across this state, the state should be the player to do this. The state has a wider menu of revenue options. They have a wider array of other services that could be curtailed or cut back to make room for education. And the state could be the player to say, okay, let's fill in the gap here and do more in those places where we need it. So our statement has basically been, this is a state priority. It's in the state constitution. This should be state funding, not another ask on the counties who have fewer tools in the toolbox and even less flexibility on the funding side.